I'm Abby.
I'm Ben.
I'm Joey.
And I'm Mike.
Welcome to Cracking the Shell, our podcast about psychological science, where we aim to bring the science of psychology to you in easily digestible nuggets, featuring work taking place right here in the University of Maryland's Department of Psychology.
Our goal is to showcase how our department is contributing to fundamental science and addressing problems that real-world folk face, whether that be substance use, parenting, work, or learning in and out of the classroom.
And if you like what you hear and want to support our activities, you can contribute by donating. Just go to psych.umd.edu. That's psyc.umd.edu. Scroll to the bottom, click Donate to Psychology, and select the fund.
It's that easy?
Yeah, it's that easy, and every dollar donated supports the really excellent work we do here at Maryland and enables us to continue our research, teaching, and outreach missions, including this podcast.
Aren't we forgetting something?
Oh yeah, I guess we should say that the views expressed in the show are those of the hosts and invited guests and are not the official views of the University of Maryland. How's that?
Awesome. Shall we get started?
Let's do it.
Hi, I'm Joey Barnett, and I am here today with Mike Dougherty, who is a professor and chair of the psychology department here at the University of Maryland. So, Mike, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast episode to talk about your expertise in memory. But before we start talking about that, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm a professor and chair here at the University of Maryland in the psych department. I've been here since 1999, and before that, got my PhD at the University of Oklahoma, and before that was basically growing up in central Kansas.
What's it like to grow up in central Kansas?
You know, when you're growing up in central Kansas, you don't really perceive there to be any difference anywhere else. But, you know, I grew up in a fairly rural area in a town called Great Bend, which is famous for maybe one thing.
What's that?
Well, this guy named Jack Kilby, which, you know, ironically, many people haven't heard of Jack.
Right.
But Jack Kilby is a Nobel laureate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not many towns can claim that they have a Nobel laureate, but yeah, he was famous for being one of the inventors of the microchip.
Wow, that's got to be one of those, like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire Jeopardy trivia questions.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure.
You know?
Well, if you're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire,
there you go.
Now you know.
Now you know.
Question.
Yeah, now you know. I've been to Kansas a couple times. I've been to Wichita and Topeka. Yeah. I've driven, I-70.
Yeah, but you haven't really been in Kansas unless you spent time in the middle of a cornfield or a wheat field.
Right. So. Yeah, I've never. So I have, but not in Kansas. I've not spent time in a cornfield.
Yeah,
in
well,
I did see a lot of corn though.
Well, seeing the corn, eating the corn is not the same thing as being in the corn.
Right. Yeah.
I spent many a summer drilling water wells in farmer fields and stuff like that. That's quite the experience.
Yeah, that sounds very strenuous.
Hot, sweaty, learned a lot, but not sure I want to go back and do it again.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks for sharing that. I understand you did a little work on working memory training. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this, area of research?
So actually, I got interested in working memory training in part because I'm really, a lot of my research is what we might call sort of use-inspired research. Like, and this is true for many scientists, get into research because we want to do work that is going to have some positive benefit for society, whether it's, individuals or, broader societal impact. And
right.
So this was an area where I felt like I could have some positive benefits on the sort of the education system or on, age-related declines in cognition, right? Can we stave that type of thing off?
So before we start delving deeper into working memory training, can you just tell us what working memory is?
Yeah, so working memory is this individual difference in people's ability to maintain information in conscious awareness. That's sort of this simple, right? What's really interesting about working memory, though, is that it seems to be important for a very wide range of everyday tasks, whether it's making plans, navigating, or reading. Even reading comprehension is correlated with individual differences in working memory.
Very interesting, and certainly a lot of real-life applicability. So what is then working memory training? Is that kind of like the Lumosity stuff that you hear about on NPR?
Yeah. So working memory training, it's a field of research focused on this question, if there are these individual differences in working memory and it's relevant for a lot of everyday tasks or everyday functioning, the question is, if we improve working memory functioning, can we also improve performance on these everyday tasks, right? So working memory training is this field where researchers, corporations even, by the way, did I mention that's like a $20 billion a year industry by some estimates?
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. If I could improve cognitive functioning, or if I could develop a set of interventions, computer games, say, that could stave off or prevent age-related declines in cognition, that would be a pretty big deal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of what this field is interested in doing, is trying to develop methodologies or tools or techniques to do that.
Well, as someone who plays, you mentioned games, someone who plays video games or computer games, the question I'm wondering is, does it work?
It would be nice if it would, that simple, right? Unfortunately, I'm just going to say, no, there's not a lot of evidence that it works in the way that we had hoped it would work.
Yeah. So it doesn't even work a little bit.
Well, I mean, as someone who was in the field looking for positive benefits on untrained tasks, as far as I can tell, the data just don't support that there's these positive benefits outside of the tasks that people actually train on.
Interesting, because I was under the impression that there were a lot of published studies on this.
Well, this has been a pretty big literature that's emerged over the last 25 years, and there are some studies out there that seem to indicate that working memory training does confer these benefits. There's some studies that show that it certainly has improvements on tasks that are very similar to the trained tasks. That's what we call near transfer, by the way.
Okay.
But more and more data are coming in that just indicate that if you're looking for gains outside of or well beyond the trained task, what we call far transfer, by the way, there's just not a lot of data that support it.
Yeah, so you mentioned near and far transfer. Can you just, for the listeners, can you just clarify what that is for us?
Well, it's actually a pretty simple construct. The idea of near transfer is if we train on a particular task, we would observe near transfer if he improved on both the task he trained on and a task that's very, very similar to the task that you trained on. So if you trained on something like, if I had you play Tetris, for example.
I do like Tetris.
Yeah, that's old school, man. It's old school.
I play a lot. Tetris. Yeah.
But if then I tested you on a game that was very similar to Tetris that involved like spatial manipulation and so on. If you showed that type of benefit, that we'd call that a successful near transfer. But what we're really interested in this field is what we call far transfer. So the idea is if you train on something like Tetris, are you better at reading maps, right, or navigating, or does it confer benefits for something like reading comprehension?
I would hope so because I play a lot of Tetris.
Well, I think for the gamers out there, you're going to be disappointed to learn that. Yeah. They're just the data just do not support. I mean, as far as my reading of it, this just doesn't support anything.
So we're starting to talk about this. Have you always been skeptical about this area of research, and why else are you skeptical if you are skeptical?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I got into this because I thought this was an opportunity for me to actually have some positive benefit on, improving learning outcomes for kids, or for age-related decline, the Alzheimer's, call it an Alzheimer's epidemic, right? There's, and so I was really quite optimistic when I started in this line of work. And it was only after really thoroughly reading the literature, observing other research that other people were doing, and then, of course, conducting our own work where we were able to successfully find near transfer. But when we looked for far transfer, the results just came back zero after zero, like null results after null results. And I don't mean just like null as in we didn't find an effect, but null as in like the point estimates. Like if we talk about how big of an effect, like we're literally like right around zero.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I was just reading this book recently called Science Fictions, which...
A great book.
Yeah, it is a great book. It talks about the kind of the nature of science, the state of the field of psychology, and also, how the field of psychology for the last, a lot of years, but specifically the last 10, 20 years, there's been a growing emphasis on what's called, reproducibility, given... that the field of psychology has been, it's been, there have been real cases of fraud and bias in our field. So can you tell us a little bit about reproducibility, as well as what you do to make your work reproducible as a scientist?
Yeah, well, what you're referring to is, we might call it the open science renaissance or the psychological science renaissance. There's really been a lot of change in our field.
Right.
Just
Absolutely.
to be clear, there's been a lot of positive improvements in psychological science over the last 10 or 10 plus years because people have really started to pay attention to the methods that we use, making sure that we're trying to reduce bias where we can. And so reproducibility is this piece of the pie where we want to make sure that our work, like if I do a study and I share the data with you, that you can take that data and confidently draw the same conclusions from the data that I would. But that requires, making sure that we're doing transparent research, sharing our data, and all that stuff.
Absolutely. That's also important. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast episode. And
My pleasure.
We look forward to having more conversations.
All right. Cheers.